everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film a wrap-up video. So these are the books that I finished at the end of the month of January that I didn't talk about finishing in any of my previous January videos. And I just want to quickly share with you the books that I finished in that final part of the month, because I did read some excellent books and I want to share them. So the first one that I finished since the last time I chatted about this was Fraud of the Century by Roy Morris Jr. This is Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel Tilden, and the Stolen Election of 1876. This is political nonfiction, all about the election of 1876, and it's very specific to that time frame. It's highly detailed, all from the lead up to the election, how the two candidates were nominated by each of the political parties. It does deal a little bit with the politics of the time, which was post-Civil War, as Jim Crow was sort of just starting and the Restoration had basically failed. Or Reconstruction had basically failed, excuse me. I found it quite interesting, but if you don't like detailed political novels, I think you might struggle with this. It is very detailed. Lots of names of long-forgotten politicians at the national level, senators and political lobbyists and newspapermen and all of that. So that can get a little overly dry and dense. But overall, the idea of, we always think that the corrupt political nature that we're currently going through in modern days is new to us, and it certainly is not. There was plenty of shenanigans and dirty doings happening back in 1876, just as there are today. I will say, though, that both Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden were, in general, very good men who they just came at the problems from different sides of the issue, and but it was the people around them who were acting in their behalf, who were not beyond breaking the rules, breaking the law, doing anything and everything in order to get their preferred candidate elected. So everything old is new again is the theme for these types of political novels. So if this is something you're interested in, I would recommend it. But if you don't like dense political nonfiction, I would steer clear. I then read two romance novels, and I read these with my romance reading buddies, Doris and Katie, and I read one on ebook and one as an audiobook, and they both were from a historical romance series, new to me, not a new author to me, but a new series to me. And the first one was the first one was Cold-Hearted Rake by Lisa Kleypas, and this was book one in this new series about the Ravenel family. And Cold-Hearted Rake is about a man who becomes titled, inherits the big estate. I can't remember if he's a duke or an earl, but he was a mister, and now he's inherited a title because his cousin has been killed, and his cousin's widow is still on the estate. So he arrives at the estate with the intention of booting her off, sending his female cousins off to some other place to live, and sort of selling off the estate and going on with his life. And because this is a romance novel, you can imagine what happens. This was a book that I really enjoyed in the beginning and didn't like as much as it ended, but I will say Lisa Kleypas writes families very well. The extended family characters in this novel were excellent. There were lots of tropes that I love, including fixing up the estate that's been run down, a female lead with a lot of spark and spine, some comical sibling characters, some funny animals that play parts in the narrative, some loyal and awesome servants. All of these things I love in a romance novel. So overall, enjoyed. I thought the ending was not to my taste, shall we say. But I was interested enough in the secondary romance, which was followed up in book 2, that we continued on. And that was Marrying Winterborne, which is book 2 in the same series. And Marrying Winterborne is about a friend of the family, Winterborne, who's a rich commoner. He owns a store and he's become rich. He falls in love with the oldest unmarried sister of the guy that died in the first book, and she is shy and has been sheltered her whole life, and this romance is very unlikely. And this particular installment, I thought it started a little slow for me. I didn't really like how the two characters interacted at the beginning, and then I really loved the ending. And this particular installation has some awesome secondary characters. We're delving into some issues of female autonomy, female independence, and how much lacking female independence was during this time period, which is the late 1800s. Some industrialization has happened. There are railways. I think it's like the 1880s, I think, is the time period we're in England. And there's another character who's a female doctor, and it discusses, the challenges and problems that she faces in trying to break into this profession, and how people don't trust a female doctor, even women. So there's all this stuff happening in the secondary characters that I loved. And then the ending, I was afraid we were going to get one of those, big misunderstanding. There's a big secret, which I don't love. And then I thought we were going to have a big misunderstanding, which drags on and on and on for like 10 chapters at the end of the book. And I always hate that. But Lisa Kleypas, I shouldn't have worried. She's a very talented romance novelist, and she does not fall into that trap of dragging the conflict on and on at the end of the book. She deals with it very well, and I was very happy with how this book ended. So overall, enjoyed those two romance novels, and it was a welcome bit of entertainment in an otherwise, stressful time period. I finished the nonfiction I was reading with Britta Bowler, Cleopatra by Stacy Schiff. This historical nonfiction, the first one that I've read by Stacy Schiff, but hopefully not my last. I really love her writing style. She really brings historical characters to life. Cleopatra is a historical figure that we all have a stereotypical image of, be from movies and plays and Shakespeare and everything. But in reality, Cleopatra was a much more complicated character or person. She was a woman who was ruling her country at a very young age. She was one of the richest people in the world at that time. Egypt was probably the richest nation in the world at this time. And she, as a teenager and through her 20s and 30s, led her country in and out of relationship with the Roman Empire, which was stretching itself at that time period. We're talking about in the 30s and 40s BC, which is something that I did not know, was that Cleopatra was ruling Egypt before Christ was born. So that was mind blown, right? I had no idea. And so not only are we getting Cleopatra's story in this book, but we also are getting Julius Caesar and Mark Antony's stories as they intertwine with Cleopatra's life. Not only those two very important historical figures, but also King Herod from the Bible fame interacts with Cleopatra. I found this fascinating. I knew very little about this time period. Britta and I enjoyed our buddy read and our conversations around this book and other things, and it has spurred us to plan to read SPQR by Mary Beard later on in the spring to inform ourselves even more about Rome, which Britta probably knows all about because I think she's already read the book once, and it'll be a reread for her, and I know now this much because I've read Cleopatra. So absolutely pick this book up. It is fantastic. It is really engaging, highly readable, compulsive, funny, highly dramatic, just all the things. This is excellent nonfiction. I then finished a historical fiction novel on ebook. And this is a book that I saw first discussed on Alan Morton's channel, and it is Ross Poldark by Winston Graham. Just had to look down at my notes because I couldn't remember the author's name. So this is the first book in the Poldark series, which you may have heard of. I guess it's a TV show on the BBC and now Netflix. A historical fiction that takes place in Cornwall, England, just after the it's like in the 1770s, so right after the American Revolution. Ross Poldark, our main character, comes back from fighting in the colonies during the American Revolution to find that his father has passed away. His land and his home have been allowed to fall down, and his fiance has decided to marry his cousin in his absence. So, he does not come home. He does not have a fun homecoming, although he had been anticipating something much different. And so we then follow Ross as he sort of picks up the pieces and what happens to him as he tries to build a life that's much different than what he had anticipated that it was going to be. Now, I was interested in reading this book after hearing Alan talk about it on his channel, or hearing Alan talk about the series on his channel, because it takes place in Cornwall, and I am planning to travel to Cornwall in this spring. So my husband and I are going to be celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary this year, and we have always said we didn't have a honeymoon when we got married. We were young and we were poor, and he was in the military, and we just had no way to go on a honeymoon at the time. So we always said that when we got to the 25th wedding anniversary, we were going to take a trip to Europe. And due to a bunch of reasons, we decided on England, but neither one of us are big. Generally, we don't prefer to be in urban areas. So I said, well, I've always wanted to go to Cornwall because its small fishing villages remind me of Maine, and I fell in love with the scenery watching the show Doc Martin. And then I heard Alan talk about this series, the Poldark series, and I thought, well, that would be fun to read in order to prepare myself for our trip to Cornwall. And it was fun to read about this area. I started to recognize the names of the towns, and sort of the descriptions of the scenery really, capture my imagination. I will say that this is an older historical fiction. I think it was written, I can't remember when it was first published, but like the 1940s, 1950s time period. And it's dated. Like Ross's attitude towards women he's not a bad guy at all, and he's certainly more progressive than other men in the area at the time, but he's not modern, and so he does not have modern sensibilities, and so some of that was really difficult for me to swallow, and there's a romance at the center of this story that is a little bit squicky from my standards as a 21st century reader. But overall, I found it quite enjoyable. It is definitely one of those types of historical fictions that there's always something happening to pull you along in the story. And the location of the story was highly interesting and engaging to me. So I plan to continue on with book 2 in this series, and see how that goes. But if you have any other suggestions for books written about Cornwall that you would like to recommend to me, please feel free to do it in the comments down below, because I would like to read more about England, and specifically Southwest England, before we make our trip over there. And then the last thing that I will talk about is The Shining Girls by Lauren Beukes, which you'll remember is a horror that I was buddy reading with Doris. She gave up on it, but I kept on. I found it interesting enough to stick with it, and I wish I liked this book more than I did. I wanted to like this book more than I did. So this is a book about a time-traveling serial killer and a young girl who was one of his intended victims who tries to track him down, and tries to solve the mystery of what is going on there. Like, she doesn't know he's a time-traveling serial killer, but she's just trying to figure out the mystery of the man who tried to kill her, because she was one of his intended victims. And the thing that I really liked about this story was all the historical bits that play into the narrative. So the serial killer is jumping back and forth between the 1930s and Depression era Chicago and other time periods up to 1993 in Chicago. So you're seeing Chicago through all these different time periods and through the eyes of his intended victims. So all these different women. There's, you know, a black woman who's working on shipbuilding during World War II. There's a woman who is a like a burlesque type dancer who's painting herself with radium. There's talk about you know, sports through the different decades, and just so many different neat historical tidbits in each of the decades that he visits. You know, there's like a creepy haunted house type situation going on that allows this guy to jump back and forth between time periods, which was not necessarily, you know, awesome, but the historical bits were really, really interesting and fun. So some pluses, some negatives. Wasn't my favorite story, but I think Lauren Beukes is an interesting author, and I would be willing to try another one by her just to see how it goes. But yeah, if the premise interests you, I would say give it a whirl and see what you think. And then I did finish one other short nonfiction, The Battle for Paradise by Naomi Klein, about Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, which I talked about in my vlog, which you will have already seen, so I'm not going to go into that one in detail, but again, that was a great read, really enjoyed it. So that's what I read at the end of the month of January. Please let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you think you might be interested in them now that you've heard me talk about them. And until the next video, I will talk to you later.